Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that was too dangerous for humans, got demoted to animals, escaped into the streets, and somehow became one of the most terrifying substances in American history, all within about 20 years. Here's the thing about PCP that nobody tells you up front. It wasn't invented by criminals. It wasn't cooked up in some filthy basement by a guy with bad teeth and worse judgment. It was created by scientists in white lab coats in one of the most respected pharmaceutical laboratories in the United States, by people who are genuinely trying to save lives. And that's the part of the story that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Not what it became, but what it started as. A miracle, a breakthrough, the future of medicine, the kind of drug that gets announced at conferences and written up in journals and toasted at company dinners, the kind of drug that makes careers. It did all of those things. And then it ate those careers alive, crawled out of the laboratory, and spent the next 2 decades terrorizing American cities in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who created it. That paradox, the cure that became the catastrophe, is the entire story of PCP. And it starts, as so many catastrophes do, with the best possible intentions. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. It is 1956, Detroit, Michigan. A city at the absolute peak of its industrial power, factories running 3 shifts, money flowing, the American century in full swing. Inside a research facility belonging to Parke-Davis Pharmaceuticals, one of the oldest and most prestigious drug companies in the country, a team of chemists is chasing something specific. Not a cure for cancer, not a treatment for depression. Something far more immediately practical and far more dangerous to get wrong, a better anesthetic. Surgery in the 1950s was a more violent negotiation than most people realize. The drugs used to put patients under, barbiturates, ether, chloroform derivatives, had a range of serious problems. They suppressed breathing, they tanked blood pressure. They were, in the bluntest possible terms, quite capable of killing the patient you were trying to save, particularly if that patient was already weakened by illness or injury. The margin between enough drug to keep you unconscious during surgery and enough drug to stop your heart was narrow enough that anesthesiologists in that era were essentially performing a high-stakes balancing act every single time someone went under the knife. The medical community desperately wanted something better, something that could block pain and consciousness without shutting down the body's core systems. Parke-Davis was determined to find it. They had the resources, they had the talent, and they had every commercial incentive in the world. Whoever cracked the perfect anesthetic would own one of the most lucrative product lines in pharmaceutical history. The chemist who synthesized the compound that would eventually become known as PCP was a man named Victor Maddox. In 1956, working through the systematic process of building and testing chemical variants, he produced a molecule with a name that no normal human being has ever successfully memorized on the first try. 1-open parenthesis, 1-phenylcyclohexyl, close parenthesis, piperidine. The company filed it under the shorthand PCP. In their internal notes, they described the early results with language that, reading it now, feels almost poignant in its optimism. Promising, remarkable, potentially revolutionary. The animal tests were extraordinary. When researchers administered PCP to laboratory animals, something happened that they had genuinely never seen before. The animals didn't go limp. They didn't lose consciousness in the traditional sense. Instead, they entered a state that looked, from the outside, like a kind of suspended animation. Eyes open, body motionless, completely unresponsive to pain stimuli, needles, heat, pressure, incisions, but breathing normally, heart rate stable, cardiovascular system untouched. The animals were, for all observable purposes, awake and physiologically intact. They simply weren't there anymore. The researchers had stumbled onto an entirely new category of drug. They called it a dissociative anesthetic. The word dissociative was precise in a way they perhaps didn't fully appreciate at the time. The drug didn't suppress the brain so much as it separated it. It cut the connection between the mind and the body's experience of the physical world. Pain signals still travelled through the nervous system. The body still registered injury, but the brain, floating somewhere unreachable, received none of it. On paper, this was exactly what medicine had been looking for. In practice, the gap between works perfectly on a rhesus monkey and works perfectly on a human being was about to reveal itself as enormous. By the late 1950s, Parke-Davis was confident enough to move toward human trials. The FDA approval process in that era was considerably less rigorous than it would later become. The thalidomide disaster, which would trigger major reform of American drug regulation, hadn't fully landed yet. Parke-Davis moved with the confidence of a company that believed in its product and operated in a regulatory environment that trusted companies to police themselves. Human trials began. Volunteers were administered PCP in controlled medical settings. The surgical teams watched, and for the first part of the procedure, everything seemed to confirm what the animal test had suggested. The patients were still, the scalpel could move, the surgery could proceed. The problem came when the patients woke up. What emerged from PCP anesthesia was not a groggy, relieved patient slowly becoming aware that their surgery was over. What emerged was something that sent nurses running for doctors and doctors running for orderlies. Patients regained physical consciousness, while their minds remained somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, enclosed, and terrifying. They reported in the aftermath sensations of being dead, of being trapped inside a body they couldn't control, of floating in a black void that had no edges and no exit. Some patients became violently agitated. Others entered states of profound confusion so complete they didn't recognize family members standing directly in front of them. Some experienced hallucinations so vivid and so horrifying that they screamed continuously for hours. The medical term for what these patients experienced is emergence delirium. The plain language translation is waking up convinced you are in hell, with no way to tell anyone and no way to get out. Parke-Davis did not immediately stop. This is the detail that matters. The emergence delirium was documented, noted, flagged in internal reports, and the trials continued. Because the cardiovascular profile was still exceptional, the drug still did the physical job better than almost anything else available. The company's researchers worked to adjust dosages, to find a threshold at which the anesthetic benefits could be preserved, while the psychological catastrophe on awakening could be minimized. They were trying to tame it. The FDA, working from the data Parke-Davis provided, approved PCP for human use in 1963 under the brand name Cernal. Cernal entered American hospitals. The results were not subtle. Across multiple institutions, the same pattern repeated. Outstanding surgical performance followed by emergence reactions so severe that medical staff began refusing to use the drug. The horror wasn't occasional. It wasn't limited to sensitive patients or unusual cases. It was consistent enough and disturbing enough that the clinical community reacted with something close to revulsion. Patients weren't just confused on waking, they were psychotic. Some required physical restraint for hours, some required psychiatric intervention. The psychological aftershocks lasted days in certain patients, not hours. Surgeons who had been genuinely excited about Cernal stopped requesting it. anesthesiologists who had read the clinical data with enthusiasm began warning their colleagues away from it. By 1965, just 2 years after its approval, Parke-Davis withdrew Cernil from human medical use. 2 years. That was all the time it took for a drug that had been developed over nearly a decade, approved by the FDA, and released with genuine medical optimism to be pulled from human application entirely. The company announced the withdrawal in the measured language of pharmaceutical communications. Additional research required, refinement of application protocols. But the reality inside hospitals was far less diplomatic. Doctors weren't waiting for refined protocols. They were telling each other, in the direct language of people who deal with screaming patients at 2 a.m, to stay away from this drug. The logical end of the story, if logic had governed what followed, would have been a quiet burial. A compound that didn't work, filed away, superseded by better options. The scientific literature would carry a footnote. A few researchers would remember it, and that would be that. But Parke-Davis made a decision that would echo for decades. They didn't destroy their investment entirely. They pivoted. If PCP was too dangerous for human patients, perhaps it still had value somewhere. Somewhere that the psychological aftermath of anesthesia didn't matter, because the patient in question couldn't describe what they'd experienced. The decision was made to repurpose PCP for veterinary use. The drug was rebranded Cernilin. It was marketed to veterinarians, zoos, and animal research facilities as an anesthetic for large primates and other animals. It worked, in that context, just as well as the animal test had always suggested. A large, dangerous animal could be sedated quickly, safely, without the cardiovascular risks of other available options. Zoos used it. Research labs used it. Wildlife conservation programs used it. Cernilin became a legitimate, widely used veterinary tool, sitting in supply rooms and refrigerators at facilities across the United States. Here is where the story takes the turn that changes everything. Because a drug that exists in supply rooms, in universities, in research institutions, in veterinary clinics, exists in a world full of human beings who are curious, or desperate, or entrepreneurial, or simply reckless. Cernilin sat on shelves in facilities with varying levels of security in an era before the strict controlled substance regulations that would later govern such things. It sat there in an America that was, in the mid-1960s, experiencing a social earthquake, a generation that had decided to question everything, including, especially, which chemicals were permissible to put in one's body. The monster in the lab coat had been given a new address, and the door was not locked. San Francisco, 1967. The summer of love. 40,000 young Americans had descended on a single neighborhood, Haight-Ashbury, carrying sleeping bags, guitars, and the unshakable conviction that reality, as their parents had defined it, was optional. The air smelled like incense and marijuana. The sidewalks were covered in flowers. LSD was so abundant it was being distributed free in punch at public gatherings. This was the most chemically experimental civilian population in American history, concentrated in a few square miles of a single city, actively searching for new ways to dissolve the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. Into this environment, at some point in 1967, arrived a small quantity of a white powder that had been sitting in a veterinary supply room. Nobody knows exactly who took it first. The historical record doesn't preserve that particular name, that particular evening, that particular moment when someone decided that a drug designed to anesthetize large primates was worth trying at a party. What the record does preserve is what happened next. The word that spread through Haight-Ashbury like electricity through a wire, moving from person to person faster than any newspaper could print, and faster than any authority could respond. The word was, "This is unlike anything you've ever taken." The drug arrived on the street with a name that aged with spectacular irony: the peace pill. Someone, in those early weeks, decided that what they'd experienced deserved a name that reflected its scale, its totality, its sense of complete departure from ordinary reality. Peace, in the language of 1967, meant freedom from the boundaries of the straight world. The peace pill, the logic went, delivered that freedom absolutely. No half measures, no gentle loosening of perception, total liberation from the self. That framing would not survive contact with what the drug actually did. The first wave of users reported experiences that split almost immediately into two categories with almost no middle ground. The first category, a profound oceanic dissolution of the self that some users described as the most intense experience of their lives, a complete departure from the body, from identity, from time. For these users, the peace pill delivered exactly what its name promised. The second category was something else entirely, and the people who fell into it didn't have peaceful names for what happened to them. They had horror stories. They came back from PCP trips describing experiences that had nothing to do with freedom or expansion or consciousness. They described imprisonment, darkness with no exit, terror so complete it had no object, because there was no longer a self intact enough to identify what it was afraid of. The ratio between those two categories shifted rapidly as dosages became inconsistent and the drug spread beyond the small circle of people who'd had access to the original, relatively pure veterinary supply. By late 1967, the horror stories were starting to outnumber the transcendent stories. By 1968, something remarkable was happening in Haight-Ashbury. Remarkable because of what it reveals about how bad a drug has to be to get rejected by a community that accepted almost everything. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which had been established specifically to treat bad LSD trips and drug-related medical emergencies in the neighbourhood, began documenting PCP cases. The doctors and volunteers there had seen a great deal. They had handled people in the grip of intense LSD psychosis, people who had overdosed on barbiturates, people who had mixed everything available and were barely coherent. They were not easily shocked. PCP shocked them. The cases were qualitatively different from anything else they treated. The duration alone was alarming. An LSD bad trip, however terrifying, typically resolved within 8 to 12 hours. PCP psychosis lasted days. Some patients remained non-functional for a week. Word moved through the drug community the way word moves through any tight community facing a shared threat. Fast, emphatic, and with the specific credibility of first-hand testimony. People who had taken the peace pill and survived the experience warned others. Experienced drug users, people who considered themselves connoisseurs of altered states, who had navigated hundreds of LSD trips without incident, said, with a directness unusual in a culture that prized open-mindedness, "Stay away from this one." By 1968, the peace pill had been effectively blacklisted by the Haight-Ashbury drug scene. Pause on that fact for a moment, because it deserves the weight it carries. The counterculture of 1967 to 68 was not a cautious movement. It was a community that had embraced LSD, peyote, mescaline, psilocybin mushrooms, amyl nitrite, and combinations of all of the above with the cheerful enthusiasm of people who decided that consciousness itself was a frontier worth exploring by any available means. That community, that maximally permissive, chemically adventurous community, looked at PCP and said no, collectively, organically, without any government campaign, without any DARE program, without any authority figure telling them what to think. The drug was too dangerous even for the people who thought no drug was too dangerous. That should have been the end of PCP's civilian career, and for a brief, strange window, roughly 1968 to 1971, it nearly was. The counterculture rejection kept PCP relatively contained. It surfaced occasionally in emergency rooms, appeared in scattered police reports, caused localized incidents in various cities. But it hadn't detonated yet. The fuse was lit, but the explosion was still coming. What nobody in the drug community, in the medical establishment or in law enforcement had fully reckoned with was the question of supply. Specifically, what happens to a drug when its legitimate manufacturer decides to stop making it? Parke-Davis, watching the mounting legal and regulatory pressure around PCP, made a business decision. In 1978, they would formally remove Sernaline from the market entirely, but even before the official withdrawal, production was being wound down through the early 1970s. The veterinary supply was tightening. The drug was becoming harder to steal from legitimate sources. Under normal circumstances, this would reduce availability and the problem would shrink. PCP was not a normal drug, and this was not a normal situation. The critical variable, the one that Parke-Davis, the FDA, and the DEA all failed to account for with sufficient urgency, was the chemistry. PCP was, among all the drugs circulating in America in the early 1970s, one of the easiest to synthesize from scratch. Not easy for a trained organic chemist with a fully equipped laboratory. Easy in a way that mattered on the street. Easy for someone with a basic understanding of chemistry, access to a community college library, and the ability to source industrial chemicals that were, at the time, completely legal to purchase. The synthesis routes were not secret. They appeared in academic chemistry literature that any library patron could request. The precursor chemicals, piperidine, cyclohexanone, phenyl-Grignard reagents, were used in industrial manufacturing processes and available through chemical supply companies without meaningful restriction. The equipment required was basic enough to set up in a kitchen or a garage, and the yield was, for someone who knew what they were doing, commercially significant. A relatively small investment in chemicals and equipment could produce enough PCP to supply a city block for weeks. This convergence, a drug with catastrophic psychological effects, a legitimate supply chain being shut down, and a synthesis route accessible to amateurs, produced an outcome that in retrospect feels almost mathematically inevitable. Underground production began, not in one place, not in one network, but simultaneously and independently across multiple cities, as the knowledge spread through the same countercultural channels that had first carried the drug's reputation. The people making PCP in 1972 and 1973 were not, for the most part, the hardened criminal organizations that would later dominate drug distribution. They were initially exactly what the counterculture had always produced: entrepreneurial amateurs with chemistry backgrounds and ideological frameworks that allowed them to frame drug production as liberation rather than crime. Some were former university students. Some were people who had worked in legitimate chemical industries. Some were simply people who had read the right journal article and owned the right equipment. The quality of what they produced varied enormously, from nearly pharmaceutical grade to dangerously contaminated batches that contained toxic byproducts capable of causing seizures before the PCP itself even had a chance to work. That inconsistency of quality would become one of PCP's defining street characteristics and one of its most dangerous. The drug began accumulating names as it spread, each name a clue to how it was being used, where it was being sold, and what it was doing to the people who took it. Angel dust because of the fine white powder that coated the plant material it was sprinkled on. Sherman stick, referring to the cigarettes, sometimes regular tobacco, sometimes marijuana, that were dipped in liquid PCP rocket fuel, a name that captured both the chemical smell of amateur synthesis and the velocity with which it hit. Killer weed when it was mixed with marijuana. Crystal for the purest forms. Hog, borrowing from its veterinary origins with a dark humour that the people dying from it might not have appreciated. Each name represented a slightly different product, a slightly different delivery method, a slightly different population of users. The drug was fragmenting into 100 local variations, each with its own subculture, its own price point, its own mythology. And it was moving east, from California toward the cities of the Midwest and the East Coast, following the highways and the networks of a country that had, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, become extraordinarily efficient at distributing controlled substances across state lines. Los Angeles received it first among the major cities, then Chicago, then, with a particular intensity that would make it the epicenter of what was coming, New York. In each city, the same pattern repeated. PCP arrived quietly, established itself in specific neighborhoods, generated alarming emergency room cases, and then exploded into visibility through the sheer extremity of what it did to the people who used it. The summer of love was 5 years in the past. The flowers had wilted. The idealism had curdled. What was left of the counterculture's drug culture was something harder, more mercenary, and far less interested in consciousness expansion as a philosophical project. The peace pill was dead, angel dust was alive, and it was hungry. To understand why angel dust did what it did to American cities, you first have to understand what it did to a single human brain, not in the abstract language of pharmaceutical literature, but in the concrete, physical, terrifying reality of what happened inside a person's skull within minutes of the drug entering their bloodstream. Most drugs, even the frightening ones, work by turning up or turning down systems that already exist. Heroin floods the brain's opioid receptors, the same receptors that respond to the body's own natural painkillers, and amplifies that signal to a catastrophic extreme. Cocaine blocks the reabsorption of dopamine, flooding the reward system. LSD binds to serotonin receptors and distorts sensory processing. These drugs are, in a crude mechanical sense, using the brain's own architecture against it. They hijack existing systems. They exaggerate or suppress what was already there. PCP did something fundamentally different. And the difference is what made it uniquely dangerous. The primary target of PCP in the brain is a receptor called the NMDA receptor, N-methyl-D-aspartate, for anyone who wants the full name and the headache that comes with it. NMDA receptors are glutamate receptors, and glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. In plain terms, NMDA receptors are central to the brain's ability to process incoming information, consolidate memory, regulate perception, and maintain the basic cognitive architecture that allows a person to understand where they are, who they are, and what is happening around them. These receptors are not a luxury feature. They are load-bearing walls. PCP doesn't just nudge these receptors, it blocks them, completely, indiscriminately, and for a duration that has almost no parallel among other psychoactive substances. When PCP enters the bloodstream and reaches the brain, it physically inserts itself into the NMDA receptor channel and sits there, preventing the normal flow of signals that allows the brain to construct reality. The technical term is open channel block. The experiential reality is something far more visceral. The machinery that builds your moment-to-moment experience of being a person in a world stops working, and whatever fills the gap is generated entirely from within, unmoored from sensation, from logic, from time. This is why PCP users don't just see things that aren't there. They inhabit realities that aren't there. LSD distorts perception, colours intensify, surfaces breathe, sounds acquire visual dimensions. It's hallucinogenic in a way that, for most users under most conditions, retain some thread connecting the distorted experience to the actual environment. The room is still recognizably a room, even if the walls are moving. PCP severs that thread entirely. Users don't experience an altered version of the room. They experience the complete replacement of the room with something the brain has constructed from scratch, using no external input whatsoever. Psychiatrists have a name for the cluster of symptoms PCP produces. They call it a PCP-induced psychosis, and what makes it clinically remarkable is how comprehensively it mimics paranoid schizophrenia. Not a mild version, not a passing resemblance. A replication so complete that emergency room physicians in the 1970s, encountering a PCP user in acute psychosis for the first time, frequently couldn't distinguish the presentation from a person experiencing a genuine first episode schizophrenic break. The paranoia, the disorganized thought, the auditory hallucinations, the catatonia alternating with explosive agitation, all of it was present and clinical and indistinguishable. This created a specific medical nightmare that played out in emergency rooms across the country. Patients admitted in a state of profound psychosis who couldn't be treated with standard antipsychotic medications because the mechanism of their psychosis was completely different from the mechanism those medications were designed to address. Haloperidol, the antipsychotic workhorse of that era, does nothing meaningful to reverse NMDA receptor blockade. Doctors were treating the symptoms while the drug sat in the patient's fat tissue and continued to release. Which brings the story to the detail that distinguished PCP from essentially every other drug of its era: lipid solubility. PCP is extraordinarily soluble in fat. This means that after the drug is absorbed into the bloodstream, it doesn't stay in the blood. It migrates into fatty tissue throughout the body, where it accumulates and sits. This fat storage functions as a slow-release reservoir. As blood levels of PCP drop, the drug gradually re-releases from fat back into circulation. The practical consequence of this pharmacological property was something that terrified both patients and the medical staff treating them. PCP users could appear to have recovered, could seem lucid and calm for a period, and then spontaneously re-enter full psychosis hours or even days later without taking anything additional. People were arrested for PCP-related incidents, held in jail cells overnight, and released the following morning appearing stable, only to re-decompensate in the street before they'd made it a block from the precinct. Patients were discharged from emergency rooms after 12 hours of observation, deemed stable, and returned by ambulance the following afternoon in worse shape than when they'd first arrived. The drug didn't just attack once. It established a beachhead in the body and attacked repeatedly, on a timeline the victim couldn't predict and the doctors couldn't reliably interrupt. But the property of PCP that generated the most documented chaos, the property that ended up defining the drug in the public imagination and in police training manuals, was none of the above. It was the analgesia. PCP, born as an anesthetic, retained its original function even in street doses. People under its influence felt no pain. Not reduced pain, not elevated pain tolerance. No pain. The drug's blockade of NMDA receptors, the same mechanism that produced the psychosis, also interrupted the neural pathways that carry pain signals to conscious awareness. A person on PCP could sustain injuries that would incapacitate an unmedicated person and simply continue, oblivious, as though nothing had happened. This single property, the absence of pain response, is what created the stories that would define PCP's reputation for the next 2 decades. It is the biological explanation behind reports that seemed, to witnesses and to the officers trying to subdue people in PCP psychosis, genuinely supernatural. When a person sustains a broken arm during a struggle and continues fighting with that arm as though it's uninjured, they are not superhuman. They are not demonic. They are experiencing complete pharmacological anesthesia of their pain system, while simultaneously inhabiting a psychosis that has removed any capacity for rational self-assessment. The combination produces behavior that has no precedent in ordinary human experience. Police officers who had spent entire careers on the street, who had dealt with people on every other available substance, encountered PCP users and reported something they couldn't frame in professional language. They reported being frightened. Not the tactical alertness of a dangerous confrontation. Actual, personal fear. The kind that comes from seeing something that doesn't behave according to any rules you've learned. The physical capabilities unlocked by PCP weren't supernatural. They were the natural physical capabilities of the human body, operating without the protective inhibitions that pain normally enforces. The human body can, under extreme circumstances, perform feats that seem impossible because pain and self-preservation instinct typically prevent it. PCP removed those limits pharmacologically. A person fighting while tolerating injuries that would stop an unmedicated person isn't accessing superhuman strength. They're accessing human strength without the circuit breakers. Understanding the mechanism doesn't make the outcomes less horrifying. There is one more dimension to PCP's pharmacology that completes the picture of why it was uniquely catastrophic: the dose-response relationship, and what it meant in the context of inconsistent street product. At low doses, very low doses, PCP produces a dissociative euphoria that some users found genuinely appealing, a dreamy detachment that felt pleasurable. At moderate doses, the dissociation becomes a psychosis. At high doses, the psychosis becomes so severe it approaches a catatonic fugue state. Complete unresponsiveness, muscle rigidity, eyes open but registering nothing. At even higher doses, PCP causes seizures, respiratory failure, and death. The gap between those dose levels was not large, and the drug being sold on the street was not pharmaceutical grade. A batch made by someone who didn't quite control the synthesis temperature would have varying concentrations across different portions of the same supply. A person who bought PCP from the same dealer twice might receive, the first time, a low-dose dissociative experience, and, the second time, a dose 3 times as strong simply because of how the powder had settled in the bag. There was no way to know. There was no way to test. There was no standardization and no recourse. Every single time someone took angel dust, they were placing an uninformed bet on a roulette wheel loaded against them, spun by amateur chemists working without quality controls, producing a drug whose therapeutic index, the margin between effective dose and lethal dose, was frighteningly narrow. The brain, meanwhile, kept no record of the bet. It simply absorbed the chemical, stopped building reality, and waited to see what the body would do in the absence of the one faculty that separates human beings from animals operating purely on instinct. What the body did, as American cities were about to discover, was not something anyone was prepared for. The first underground PCP lab, the DEA, ever officially documented was discovered in 1972 in Los Angeles. It was not a sophisticated operation. It occupied the back room of a rented house in a residential neighborhood, used equipment that could have been purchased at any scientific supply store, and was operated by 2 men with undergraduate chemistry backgrounds and a library of academic journal articles that they'd photocopied at university campus they no longer attended. The operation was dismantled. The men were arrested. The DEA agents who processed the scene filed their report and moved on, satisfied that the problem had been contained. Within 18 months, there were an estimated dozen similar operations in Los Angeles County alone. The DEA's mistake, and it was a mistake shared by every law enforcement agency in America at that moment, was treating underground PCP production as a criminal problem with a criminal solution. Find the lab, shut it down, Arrest the chemist. Problem solved. What they failed to account for was that the knowledge couldn't be arrested. The synthesis route existed in academic literature. The precursor chemicals were legal and commercially available. The equipment was unregulated. Every time a lab was shut down, the people connected to it, the distributors, the users, the curious, already knew the basic outline of how the product was made. Some of them went and made it. This is the dynamic that makes PCP's spread in the early 1970s different from the spread of, say, heroin or cocaine. Those drugs required supply chains that stretched to foreign countries, poppy fields in Southeast Asia, coca plantations in South America. Interdiction, however imperfect, could create real friction in those supply chains. PCP required a trip to a chemical supply company and access to a kitchen with adequate ventilation. The entire supply chain was domestic, dispersed, and essentially impossible to choke off at the source. The underground chemists of the early 1970s were not a monolithic group. They ranged across a spectrum of competence and motivation that had enormous consequences for the people consuming their product. At one end of the spectrum were the careful ones, former chemistry students or lab workers who understood what they were doing, controlled their reaction temperatures, purified their product, and produced something that, while still extraordinarily dangerous by virtue of being PCP, was at least consistently dosed. These operations tended to be small, discreet, and focused on specific distribution networks where the quality could be monitored. At the other end of the spectrum were the catastrophically incompetent ones, and they were far more common. The synthesis of PCP involves several chemical steps, each requiring specific temperature controls, specific reagents added in specific sequences, and specific purification processes afterward. Skip a purification step, and the product contains precursor chemicals that are themselves toxic. Overheat a reaction stage, and the synthesis produces byproducts with their own psychoactive or neurotoxic properties that are entirely uncharacterized. No one knows what they do to the human brain because no one has ever studied them. The street product that emerged from these careless operations was not simply PCP. It was PCP plus a variable cocktail of chemical contaminants whose effects were completely unpredictable and occasionally fatal on their own, independent of the PCP content. Emergency room physicians in Los Angeles began noticing this in 1973 and 1974. 2 patients admitted in the same week with what appeared to be PCP psychosis would present completely differently. One with the characteristic dissociation and analgesia, the other with violent seizures and symptoms that looked more like organophosphate poisoning than anything PCP should produce. Toxicology screens confirmed PCP in both cases. What the screens couldn't identify were the contaminants, because the labs weren't testing for compounds that had no established clinical profile. Doctors were diagnosing and treating a moving target that changed composition with every new batch. The economics of underground PCP production accelerated the spread with a logic that was, from a purely market perspective, impeccable. The cost to produce a kilogram of PCP for an experienced underground chemist with established chemical supply sources was somewhere between $100 and $300 in early 1970s prices. That kilogram, converted to street doses and distributed across a city, could retail for tens of thousands of dollars. The profit margin dwarfed almost every other drug on the market. Heroin required expensive importation and distribution networks that ate into margins. Marijuana was bulky, difficult to conceal, and subject to agricultural variables. PCP was light, potent in tiny quantities, and manufacturable anywhere with a chemistry set. The money attracted people who were not idealistic counterculture chemists. It attracted professional criminals with distribution infrastructure and no interest whatsoever in product quality. As PCP moved from its early, relatively contained networks into the broader urban drug market, the production shifted from amateur chemists with academic pretensions toward organized criminal enterprises that cared about one thing: yield. How much product, how fast, at what cost. Quality control was an expense they didn't budget for. By 1973, PCP was moving through the drug distribution networks of Los Angeles with enough volume to be considered a significant market presence. The city's drug landscape absorbed it the way a body of water absorbs a new tributary, not all at once, but steadily, until the new flow had altered the character of the whole. Dealers who primarily sold marijuana discovered that dipping a joint in liquid PCP before selling it produced a dramatically more intense effect that commanded dramatically higher prices. Some of them disclosed this to customers, many did not. This practice, selling PCP-laced marijuana without the buyer's knowledge, introduced an entire population of people to PCP who had no idea they were taking it. The first sign that something other than marijuana was involved was typically the onset of dissociation so severe that the user had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. People who had smoked marijuana hundreds of times and believed they were doing so again suddenly found themselves unable to locate their own bodies. The terror of that experience, not just a bad trip but a complete and incomprehensible rupture with reality, drove significant numbers of emergency room admissions that were initially logged as unknown substance, possible LSD, before the clinical picture clarified. From Los Angeles, PCP's spread followed the geography of American drug distribution with depressing predictability. It moved along the interstate highway system, carried by distributors who had learned early that the drug's extraordinary potency relative to its weight made it ideal for long-distance transport. A dealer could carry enough PCP to supply a medium-sized city in a package the size of a paperback novel. Border agents, customs officials, and highway patrol officers had no established search protocol for a drug that had only recently become illegal and whose physical characteristics they barely knew. Chicago received significant quantities of PCP by 1974. Detroit, with a particular grim irony given that it was the city where the drug had been invented 2 decades earlier, became a significant market shortly afterward. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. Each city integrated the drug into its existing street economy with local variations in distribution method and street terminology, but the pharmacological reality was identical everywhere. The drug did what it did, regardless of what it was called or who was selling it. New York's encounter with PCP began slightly later than Los Angeles, but escalated faster and with greater intensity, partly because of the density of the population and the existing robustness of the city's drug distribution infrastructure. By 1975, angel dust was available in specific neighborhoods of the Bronx, Harlem, and Brooklyn, with enough consistency to establish regular customer bases. The Bronx in particular, already decimated by landlord arson, municipal abandonment, and the displacement of entire communities, became ground zero for what PCP would do when it encountered a population with limited options and unlimited need for escape. The drug was cheap. This fact cannot be overstated in any honest account of how PCP spread through urban America. A single dose cost between $1 and $3 at various points in the mid-1970s, less than a pack of cigarettes. Other drugs that produced comparable intensity of effect cost many times more. Heroin required a supply chain that inflated street prices. LSD was difficult to produce consistently in quantity. PCP was manufactured around the corner, possibly literally, and priced accordingly. For communities where disposable income was scarce and suffering was structural, the economics made a brutal kind of sense. The people who absorbed the worst of what was coming were not the suburban experimenters who occasionally encountered the drug at parties and fled from it after a single bad experience. They were the residents of neighborhoods that America had already decided to abandon, places where the choice wasn't between PCP and a comfortable middle-class existence, but between PCP and other forms of obliteration that the environment provided in abundance. That context matters. It would continue to matter when the response came, or rather, when the particular shape of the non-response revealed exactly whose safety American drug policy was actually designed to protect. Underground production kept accelerating through 1974 and 1975, feeding distribution networks that were growing faster than any enforcement agency could map. The DEA, understaffed and underfunded, was dismantling individual labs while the overall production capacity expanded. Each arrested chemist was a minor setback in an industry that had no headquarters, no central organization, and no single point of failure. The knowledge was distributed. The supply was distributed. The damage was distributed. And in emergency rooms from Los Angeles to New York, doctors were about to start seeing things that would make the early case reports from Haight-Ashbury look like a mild warning. The first thing emergency room nurses learned to recognize was the eyes. People brought in on PCP had a specific ocular presentation that experienced staff could identify from across the room before any other assessment was made. The pupils were often normal-sized, unlike heroin, which pinned them to pinpoints, or stimulants, which blew them wide open. But the eyes themselves were wrong in a way that was harder to describe clinically and easier to understand viscerally. They moved in rapid, irregular bursts, a phenomenon called nystagmus, an involuntary oscillation of the eyeballs that PCP produced with remarkable consistency. More than the nystagmus, though, it was the quality of attention behind the eyes that registered first with experienced staff. There was nobody home. Not the glazed absence of someone deeply sedated. Something more active and more disturbing. The eyes were moving, scanning, responding to stimuli that existed only inside the skull behind them. Getting a blood pressure reading on these patients was often the first physical confrontation of many. By 1974, emergency departments in Los Angeles County were treating PCP cases with enough regularity that the county health department had begun circulating internal memos on management protocols. The memos were notable for what they couldn't recommend as much as for what they could. No antidote existed. No medication reliably reversed the psychosis. The suggested approach was essentially minimize stimulation, restrain if necessary, wait. The average duration of acute PCP psychosis requiring hospitalization was 48 to 72 hours. Some cases ran longer. The record documented in Los Angeles County records from that period was a patient who remained in continuous acute psychosis for 11 days. 11 days. Locked inside a brain that had stopped processing reality, in a body that felt no pain, in a hospital room that required continuous staff rotation because no single team could manage the sustained physical and psychological demands of the case. The restraint question was one that hospitals were entirely unprepared for. Standard medical restraints, the soft cuffs used for agitated patients, the wrist ties used for people at risk of removing their IV lines, were designed for people who were fighting against them with normal human pain sensitivity. A person in PCP psychosis fighting against a restraint felt nothing. They pulled against the cuff until the cuff cut into the skin, until the skin broke, until the underlying tissue was damaged, and continued pulling as though none of that was happening, because for them, neurologically, none of it was. Hospitals began ordering industrial-grade restraints designed for psychiatric facilities. Even those required supplementation with physical holds by multiple staff members during the worst episodes. The nursing staff bore the brunt of this in ways that institutional documentation rarely captures adequately. Nurses were bitten, struck, and thrown across rooms by patients who, in ordinary circumstances, would have been incapable of generating that level of force or that level of sustained aggression. The patients weren't malicious, they weren't criminals in the majority of cases. They were people whose brains had been chemically stripped of the architecture that produces empathy, self-awareness, and behavioral inhibition, leaving behind something that operated on pure, unmediated animal response to perceived threat. Everything was a threat. Every touch was an attack. Every face was an enemy. The physical injuries sustained by PCP users themselves during these episodes were catalogued in medical literature with a specificity that reads, in retrospect, as barely contained disbelief. Broken fingers from striking walls, fractured wrists from fighting restraints with full body force, dislocated shoulders, lacerations from broken glass that the patient had walked through without any apparent awareness, burns from contact with heat sources. One documented Los Angeles case from 1974 involved a man who had walked on a broken ankle for an estimated 6 hours before anyone intervened, the fracture visible on the X-ray as a complete break that should have made weight-bearing immediately impossible. He had not limped. He had not favoured the leg. He had been entirely unaware. These cases reached the New York City hospital system in volume by 1975, and the Bronx, predictably, given the concentration of the drug in that borough, generated some of the most extreme documented presentations. Bronx Municipal Hospital, Lincoln Hospital, North Central Bronx Hospital, each accumulating case files that emergency physicians circulated among themselves with the informal urgency of people trying to understand something genuinely new. The consensus that emerged from those informal networks, months before any formal medical literature caught up, was that PCP was not like other drugs. It required different thinking, different resources, and different preparation. The police were reaching the same conclusion through a more violent educational process. NYPD officers in the Bronx began encountering PCP, involved incidents with regularity by late 1975. The department had no formal training protocol for PCP at that point. The drug wasn't in the standard substance awareness curriculum, the effects weren't described in patrol officer training, and the specific tactical implications of confronting someone who felt no pain and had no capacity for rational response to commands were nowhere in the operational guidance that officers carried with them. They were learning in the field. The lessons were expensive. A standard police response to an agitated, combative individual relied on a specific progression: verbal commands, physical presence, escalating physical control techniques, with the implicit assumption that pain compliance, the use of joint locks, pressure points, and control holds that work by creating discomfort, would function as a reliable de-escalation tool at some point in the progression. PCP users broke that model completely. Verbal commands produced no response. Physical presence produced no response. Pain compliance techniques produced no response because there was no pain to comply with. Officers who applied a wrist lock designed to stop a resisting suspect through discomfort found that the suspect continued resisting, and the wrist broke, and the resisting continued. The department began informal internal discussions about how many officers were needed to safely handle a PCP-involved individual. The number that kept appearing in these discussions was 6. 6 officers to safely manage one person on angel dust. Not to subdue them with lethal force, but to restrain them safely enough that they didn't injure themselves further, while also not injuring the officers. For context, a standard street confrontation with a physically large, aggressively resisting individual typically required 2 to 3 officers. PCP doubled that requirement and then some. Officers began developing their own informal protocols, shared at precinct level through word of mouth rather than official channels. Keep distance. Don't attempt pain compliance. Go for full body restraint immediately with maximum available personnel. Protect the head. Don't let them near hard surfaces. None of this was in any manual. All of it was learned from specific incidents, where the failure to follow these improvised rules had resulted in someone being seriously hurt. Simultaneously, the demographic reality of who was using PCP was becoming impossible to ignore. The drug had not spread uniformly across the city. It was concentrated in specific neighborhoods, Black and Latino communities in the Bronx, Harlem, and parts of Brooklyn, with a density that reflected both the distribution networks operating in those areas and the economic accessibility of the drug. PCP was the cheapest serious high available. In communities where economic despair was structural and deep, the market logic was inexorable. This demographic concentration had consequences that extended far beyond public health. It shaped which neighborhoods received emergency resources, which populations were treated with sympathy versus fear in the medical and law enforcement response, and which communities were characterized in press coverage as victims of a public health crisis versus threats requiring containment. The language used to describe PCP users in 1975, New York press coverage is instructive. The emphasis fell heavily on danger, on superhuman strength, on the terrifying unpredictability of people in PCP psychosis. The suffering of those same people, the fact that they were the primary victims of the drug's effects, that many had taken it unknowingly, that many were teenagers, received considerably less column space. The New York Times ran its first substantial PCP story in October 1975. The headline used the word terror. The story described incidents with the narrative structure of a monster movie. The threat, the inadequate response, the escalating danger. It was not inaccurate in its facts. But the framing it established would prove durable in ways that had real policy consequences. PCP users as monsters to be feared, not patients to be treated. That framing was about to get amplified by an order of magnitude, because the press had barely scratched the surface of what was actually happening. The cases that made the 1975 Times story were selected for their dramatic quality, but the emergency rooms and the precinct logs contained dozens of equally extreme incidents that hadn't been written up yet. The dam of public attention was beginning to crack. Behind it was enough horror to fuel a national conversation, and enough genuine tragedy to deserve one, though the conversation that actually arrived would prove more interested in horror than in tragedy. Washington, D.C. was generating its own case files. Chicago's Cook County Hospital was running out of the specific restraint equipment it had ordered. Los Angeles County USC Medical Center had designated a specific treatment area for PCP patients, separated from the general emergency population, because the management requirements were so different and so demanding that integrating them into standard triage created chaos. Angel dust was no longer a street problem. It was a hospital problem, a police problem, and within months, it would become the kind of problem that lands on the desks of people in Washington who have the authority to do something about it, and the track record to ensure that whatever they did would be complicated by politics, by race, and by the particular American genius for addressing drug crises in ways that punish the addicted rather than treating them. The stories coming out of the emergency rooms were extraordinary. The stories that weren't being told yet were worse. In January 1976, a television news crew from a New York affiliate filmed the aftermath of a PCP incident in the Bronx. The footage showed a stretch of sidewalk, a group of officers, and a single individual who had required the combined effort of 7 people to bring to the ground. The individual was not large. He was, by the attending officer's estimate, around 160 pounds. He had broken 2 sets of handcuffs before a third set held. The filming lasted 4 minutes. The broadcast lasted 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds aired during the evening news, and the phones at the station rang continuously for 3 hours afterward. America had just met angel dust in its living room. The media response that followed over the next 18 months was not journalism in any careful sense of the word. It was amplification. Newspapers, television stations, and radio programs across the country took the most extreme documented PCP incidents and presented them in a format that was indistinguishable from horror fiction, except that the events were real, the names were real, and the hospitals and police precincts were real. The New York Daily News alone published 14 major PCP stories between January and December 1976. Each story escalated the previous one in the specificity of its terror, the extremity of its case studies, the urgency of its implicit question. What is being done about this? The answer, as of early 1976, was not enough and not fast enough. The DEA's PCP task force, established in 1974, was working with resources that bore no relationship to the scale of the problem it faced. The agency had identified the basic geography of underground production, concentrated in Southern California, with significant secondary operations in the Midwest, but the distributed domestic nature of PCP manufacturing made the standard interdiction playbook nearly useless. Agents could raid a lab, document the operation, arrest the operators, and return 3 months later to find a new operation running 2 streets away. The knowledge was unkillable. The market was insatiable. The profit margins were so extreme that the mathematics of deterrence simply didn't function. The potential sentence for PCP manufacturing, under the laws as they existed in 1976, was insufficient to outweigh the financial incentive for anyone already operating outside the law. Congress was receiving pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Police departments in major cities were submitting formal reports to their respective city governments, documenting the specific operational failures that PCP created. Medical associations were generating statistics on emergency room burden that were alarming in their trajectory, not just the absolute numbers, but the rate of increase. The year-over-year growth in PCP-related emergency admissions between 1974 and 1976 was steep enough that health economists were projecting, with uncomfortable precision, what the hospital system would look like by 1980 if current trends continued. The press was generating public outrage with industrial efficiency, and public outrage, in a democracy, eventually reaches legislators who need votes. The legislative response arrived in stages, each stage revealing both genuine urgency and the specific distortions that political pressure introduces into drug policy. The Psychotropic Substances Act of 1978 significantly increased federal penalties for PCP manufacture and distribution, placing it in the most serious scheduling category for substances with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential. The penalties were severe: mandatory minimums, significant sentencing enhancements for quantities above certain thresholds. On paper, this represented exactly the kind of muscular federal response the press coverage had been demanding. In practice, it changed almost nothing about the availability of PCP on the street. Mandatory minimums don't reduce drug supply when the people manufacturing the drug are making enough money to absorb the risk, and when the manufacturing knowledge is so widely distributed that arresting one producer creates an immediate market opportunity for the next. The 1978 legislation satisfied the political requirement for a visible response without addressing any of the underlying mechanisms that were driving the crisis. The precursor chemicals remained legal. The synthesis knowledge remained accessible. The economic conditions in the communities where PCP use was concentrated remained unchanged. What changed were the sentences received by the people at the lowest levels of the distribution chain, the street-level dealers and small-scale producers who were the easiest to arrest and the least important to the overall supply. This pattern, severe penalties falling heaviest on the most economically vulnerable participants in the drug economy, while the structural conditions enabling that economy remained intact, was not a new discovery in American drug policy. It was a reliable feature, appearing with such consistency across different drugs and different decades that describing it as an accident requires a degree of willful blindness. The police crisis, meanwhile, was evolving independently of legislation. By 1977, police departments in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia had all developed some version of specialized PCP response protocols. But the development had been so piecemeal and so disconnected that a protocol effective in one city was unknown in another. There was no national coordination, no shared database of what worked and what didn't, no federal framework for distributing the tactical lessons that officers in the Bronx had learned through injury and improvisation. The weapon question had become particularly acute. By 1977, it was well established that standard pain compliance tools, batons, pressure point techniques, joint manipulation, were functionally useless against someone in PCP psychosis. The question that police administrators were asking behind closed doors was what this meant for use of force policy. If the standard escalation ladder didn't function, if the rungs between verbal command and lethal force were all missing when PCP was involved, what options did an officer have? The answer most departments arrived at was more bodies. Overwhelm with numbers, achieve rapid, full-body restraint before the situation escalates to the point where lethal options are considered. The medical consequences of this approach for PCP users were significant. Restraint-related deaths, deaths caused by positional asphyxia, by the physiological stress of prolonged violent struggle, by the combination of PCP's cardiovascular effects and extreme physical exertion, began appearing in medical examiner reports with increasing frequency. These were not deaths from bullets or batons. They were deaths from the process of being subdued, in a body that felt no pain and therefore couldn't communicate distress, by people who had no reliable way to assess whether the person they were restraining was medically deteriorating. The coroners called it excited delirium. The phrase would become one of the most contested in American forensic medicine. But in the mid-1970s, it was simply a clinical description of what was happening, without the political weight it would later accumulate. The medical establishment's own crisis ran parallel and received considerably less press coverage. Emergency medicine as a formal specialty was itself relatively new. The American Board of Emergency Medicine was established in 1979, and the physicians staffing emergency departments in 1976 and 1977 were navigating PCP without specialist training, without established treatment protocols, and without pharmaceutical tools designed for the problem they faced. The medications available for managing acute psychosis, haloperidol, chlorpromazine, addressed dopamine and serotonin pathways. PCP psychosis operated on glutamate pathways. Using the available antipsychotics to manage a PCP patient was pharmacologically approximate at best. It might reduce agitation through sedation, but it didn't touch the underlying mechanism. Benzodiazepines, Valium and its relatives, proved more useful for managing agitation, and by 1977 they had become the informal first-line response in emergency departments, with significant PCP experience. But benzodiazepines were a management tool, not a treatment. They could make the patient safer and the environment calmer without shortening the duration of the psychosis itself. The 48 to 72-hour minimum was irreducible. Every hour of that window occupied a hospital bed, consumed nursing staff time, and required the kind of sustained physical management that burned through shift capacity in ways that disrupted care for everyone else in the department. A hospital in the Bronx running 5 or 6 active PCP cases on a Friday night was not a hospital functioning at normal capacity. It was an institution operating at the edge of its ability to manage its own workload, triaging everything else around the immovable demands of patients who required constant attention and couldn't be discharged until the drug released its grip on their neurology. The press coverage continued to accelerate. By 1977, PCP had achieved a level of national media saturation that had no real precedent for a drug of its kind, more than heroin, which had been a crisis for decades, and more than cocaine, which was still being framed primarily as an affluent recreational drug. PCP occupied a unique position in the American media imagination. It was a drug whose effects were so extreme, so visually dramatic, so comprehensively alien to normal human experience, that it reliably generated the kind of content that sold newspapers and held television audiences through commercial breaks. The coverage had a feedback effect that nobody in the media appeared to account for. Stories about PCP's terrifying properties reached people who had never heard of the drug, in communities that hadn't yet been significantly exposed to it. For most people, the effect was pure deterrence. The stories were so frightening that the drug became unthinkable. But for a specific subset of people, young, marginal, already existing outside the social structures that the mainstream media assumed as its audience, the coverage functioned differently. The drug's terrifying reputation made it interesting. The stories of superhuman strength and total fearlessness, stripped of their medical horror, sounded to certain ears like a description of power. The media had inadvertently written the most effective drug advertisement in American history. They had made angel dust famous, and fame in the drug market is a sales mechanism. The Bronx in 1977 was burning, not metaphorically, literally. Landlords in the South Bronx were torching their own buildings for insurance money, and entire city blocks were reduced to rubble fields that looked more like post-war Europe than a borough of the largest city in America. Into this landscape of institutional abandonment and physical devastation, 2 things arrived almost simultaneously: angel dust and hip-hop. The connection between them is not comfortable to discuss, and it has been frequently sanitized in the celebratory histories of hip-hop's origin story. But the early years of that culture, the block parties, the parks, the community centres, existed inside the same geography and the same social ecosystem, where PCP was circulating with devastating effect. The people who created hip-hop were not for the most part PCP users. Many of the culture's founding figures were actively opposed to it, understanding viscerally that the drug was destroying the communities they were trying to build something within. But PCP was present. It was in the environment the way poverty was in the environment, not celebrated, not chosen, but inescapable as a fact of daily life. The early rap records that touched on drug use did so with a directness that reflected lived proximity rather than artistic distance. The references to angel dust in early hip-hop lyrics were rarely glamorizing. They were more often cautionary, or simply documentary, the way a photograph of a burned building is documentary. This is what our world looks like. This is what is here. The drug appeared in the lyrics the way it appeared on the corner, as a reality that required acknowledgement before it could be navigated. Hollywood processed PCP differently, because Hollywood's relationship with reality has always been mediated by what sells tickets. The film industry had been watching the PCP press coverage with the attentiveness of an industry that understood with professional precision, the commercial value of the American public's fear response. By 1977 and 1978, the drug's reputation had reached the point where it functioned as a narrative shorthand, a single reference that could establish a character as maximally dangerous, maximally unpredictable, beyond the reach of normal human engagement. PCP didn't just appear in films as a plot element, it became a character type. The person on PCP in a late 1970s film was a specific archetype. Unstoppable, incomprehensible, requiring either massive collective force or lethal response to contain. This cinematic representation had real consequences. It deepened the cultural association between PCP, urban environments, and specific demographic groups in ways that would outlast the drug's peak years and continue shaping both public perception and policy long after angel dust had been displaced by other substances. The monster imagery that the press had established became permanent through repetition in popular culture, not as a description of a pharmacological effect, but as a racialized mythology about who used drugs and what they became. The urban legend ecosystem that grew around PCP during this period was extraordinary in its productivity and its durability. Some of the stories were true, some were partially true, distorted through retelling. Some were entirely fabricated, but so structurally consistent with genuine documented cases that they circulated with the authority of first-hand testimony for years before anyone attempted verification. The story of the man who jumped from a 6-story building in the Bronx, convinced he could fly, existed in at least 4 distinct versions, circulating simultaneously in 1977, each with different specific details, different outcomes, different neighborhoods. Researchers attempting to verify these accounts against hospital and police records found some grounding in actual incidents. There were documented cases of PCP users jumping from significant heights, surviving through a combination of adrenaline, impaired pain response, and the specific physics of how bodies fall. But the specific details of the most widely circulated versions were unverifiable. The story of a Washington, D.C. man who swam the Potomac River in February while in PCP psychosis was different. It was real, it was documented, and the specifics were if anything more disturbing than the versions that circulated informally. He had entered the water from a bridge, swum approximately half a mile in water, cold enough to cause fatal hypothermia in a person of normal pain, sensitivity within minutes, emerged on the opposite bank, walked 4 blocks in soaking clothes in near-freezing temperatures, and was found by officers who initially thought he had simply fallen into the river and been extraordinarily lucky. He had no memory of any of it. The hypothermia that should have stopped him had registered nothing in his nervous system. His core temperature when measured at the hospital was low enough that the attending physician initially questioned the accuracy of the thermometer. These documented cases fed the legend ecosystem, and the legend ecosystem fed itself, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The stories served psychological functions for different audiences simultaneously. For communities directly affected by PCP, the legends were a way of processing something genuinely traumatic. The experience of watching neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into something unrecognizable was not something that ordinary grief language could accommodate. The legends gave that experience a narrative container. For communities that removed from the drug's direct effects, the legends served a different function. They maintained a safe distance between the audience and the horror, transforming something that was fundamentally a public health and social justice catastrophe into something that felt more like folklore. Folklore is easier to live with than structural failure. The music industry's engagement with PCP shifted as the decade turned. What had been documentary or cautionary in the earliest hip-hop references began, in some quarters, to acquire a different quality. The drug's reputation for producing fearlessness, the real pharmacological phenomenon of analgesia, refracted through the legend ecosystem into something approaching myth, began to function as a brand attribute for certain performers and certain communities where the performance of invulnerability had specific social currency. Being associated with angel dust wasn't the same as using it. The association itself carried meaning. It placed you outside the boundaries of what normal society could threaten or contain. This was not unique to hip-hop, and attributing it primarily to that culture is both inaccurate and unfair. Rock music had been performing its own version of pharmaceutical invulnerability for a decade. The excess of Led Zeppelin, the self-destruction of the Rolling Stones, the death wish of punk. The difference was that when white rock musicians performed their relationship with dangerous drugs, the cultural framing was transgressive glamour. When black artists in the Bronx or Harlem were associated with PCP, the cultural framing was threat. The drug was identical. The cultural metabolism of it was entirely different, and the difference had nothing to do with the drug. Meanwhile, in the actual streets rather than the cultural representations of them, PCP was generating incidents that required no mythological enhancement. The documented case files from NYPD precincts in the Bronx and from Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, records from 1977 and 1978, contain entries that read like fiction, not because they have been exaggerated, but because the pharmacological reality of PCP produced outcomes that fall outside the range of what the human brain, in normal operation, considers possible. A documented LAPD incident from 1977 involved an individual who sustained a gunshot wound during an altercation while in PCP psychosis and continued for an estimated 11 minutes before the blood loss reached a threshold sufficient to override the analgesia. The wound was not minor. The responding officers, who had not yet been briefed on PCP's analgesic properties, filed a report that used the word impossible 3 times in 4 paragraphs. The individual survived. The officers requested immediate department-wide training on PCP. The training was approved 14 months later. 14 months. The gap between the generation of specific, actionable knowledge about a public safety threat and the institutional response to that knowledge is one of the quietly damning measurements of how seriously authorities were treating the crisis. The urban legend machinery took cases like this one and processed them into something that spread at the speed of human conversation, at bodegas, on stoops, in barbershops, in the specific social infrastructure of dense urban communities where information moves through personal networks with an efficiency that no media platform of that era could match. By the time any given PCP story had travelled through 3 or 4 neighbourhood networks, the details had acquired the polish of repeated telling. The facts had been sorted for maximum impact. The mundane medical reality had been translated into the vernacular of the community receiving it, and the drug kept arriving, cheaper every year, as production efficiency improved and competition between underground manufacturers drove prices down. More available every month as the distribution networks matured and the market for a drug that cost almost nothing to produce and almost nothing to buy expanded to fill every available space in communities that had been given almost nothing else. The cultural conversation about PCP, in music, in film, in the legend networks of urban neighbourhoods, was enormous, sprawling, and almost entirely disconnected from the policy conversation happening in Washington. Those 2 conversations occupied the same America but barely intersected, because they were about fundamentally different things. The cultural conversation was about what PCP felt like, what it meant, what it represented about the condition of the communities it had colonized. The policy conversation was about threat containment, about sentencing, about the political optics of being seen to act. Between those two conversations, the people actually experiencing the drug, using it, treating its victims, policing its consequences, were generating a third conversation that was quieter and more honest than either of the other two, and that no one in a position of power was listening to with any consistency. That conversation was about a drug that was beginning finally to recede, not because of anything Washington had done, not because of any law enforcement success, not because of any treatment breakthrough, but because of something far simpler and, in its simplicity, far more instructive about how drug epidemics actually end. The thing that killed angel dust dominance wasn't a law. It wasn't a task force, a sentencing enhancement, or a presidential declaration. It wasn't a public health campaign or a treatment breakthrough or a coordinated federal strategy. What killed angel dust dominance was word of mouth, the same mechanism that had originally spread it. By 1979, the accumulated testimony of people who had taken PCP and survived the experience had reached a critical mass in the communities most affected by it. Not the sanitized, medically framed warnings of public health literature, not the monster movie framing of newspaper coverage, the raw, personal, specific testimony of people who had lost weeks of their lives to a drug-induced psychosis, who had woken up in hospitals with injuries they had no memory of sustaining, who had watched friends become unrecognizable and remain that way for days. This testimony travelled through the same personal networks that had originally distributed the drug's reputation, and it carried the weight of direct experience that no press campaign could manufacture or replicate. The street-level rejection of PCP that had begun in Haight-Ashbury in 1968 and had then been overwhelmed by the drug spread into urban markets that didn't have the same information networks was happening again, but this time at scale. Dealers in the Bronx reported declining demand. Emergency room admissions in Los Angeles County, which had peaked in 1978, began a measurable downward trend in 1979. Police departments noted a reduction in PCP-involved incidents that preceded, rather than followed, the legislative changes that politicians would later credit with the improvement. The drug didn't disappear. It contracted. It retreated into smaller, more specific markets. People with established habits, people who actively sought its particular effects, people in specific communities where the information networks that were driving the broader rejection hadn't penetrated with equal force. PCP became a regional drug, concentrated in specific cities, specific neighborhoods, specific demographics, rather than the expanding national emergency it had been between 1975 and 1978. Then crack cocaine arrived, and the conversation ended completely. The crack epidemic that began reshaping American urban drug markets in 1984 and exploded into full national visibility by 1986 was so catastrophically efficient as a market product, more addictive than powder cocaine, cheaper per dose than almost anything else available, with a distribution model so rapid and so profitable that it reorganized existing drug networks almost overnight, that it effectively displaced every other street drug from its dominant market position. Heroin retreated. Methamphetamine retreated. PCP retreated. The economics were simply overwhelming. Crack was more addictive, which meant more reliable repeat customers, more accessible, which meant a broader market, and more profitable per unit, which meant distributors abandoned other products. The press, which had spent 3 years building angel dust into a national terror, pivoted to crack with identical machinery and identical framing. The same monster narratives, the same superhuman strength stories, the same racialized urban geography, the same implicit question about what was being done. The machinery required a monster, and crack was a more efficient one. PCP receded from national consciousness with surprising speed. By 1985, it barely appeared in national drug use statistics. By 1988, the DEA's annual reports were treating it as a secondary concern, present, noted, no longer driving the conversation. The emergency rooms that had been overwhelmed in 1977 and 1978 had retrained their protocols around crack and the violence that accompanied its distribution. A generation of police officers who had learned to dread the specific look of a PCP incident, the oscillating eyes, the unearthly stillness alternating with explosive force, began to encounter it only occasionally. The medical literature on PCP continued accumulating, now freed from the urgency of crisis management and able to engage more systematically with the drug's pharmacology. The research conducted in the late 1970s and 1980s on PCP's mechanism of action, the NMDA receptor blockade, the glutamate pathway disruption, turned out to be extraordinarily scientifically valuable, not because anyone was trying to rehabilitate PCP, but because understanding how blocking NMDA receptors produce psychosis gave researchers a new framework for understanding schizophrenia itself. The PCP model of psychosis, the observation that a drug producing NMDA receptor blockade created a syndrome indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, became one of the foundational pieces of evidence for the glutamate hypothesis of schizophrenia, which suggested that the condition involved disruptions to glutamate signaling rather than, or in addition to, the dopamine dysregulation that had dominated psychiatric thinking for decades. This research opened treatment avenues that are still being actively explored. The drug that had devastated urban America in the 1970s became, in its aftermath, an inadvertent contribution to psychiatric science. Victor Maddox's molecule, synthesized in 1956 to save lives, had destroyed thousands of them, and then, in the wreckage, provided clues that might eventually save thousands more. That irony is not redemptive, it is simply true. The first significant PCP resurgence came in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s. The city, which had been one of the drug's original major markets in the 1970s, never fully expelled it. It had simply suppressed to a level below public visibility. By 1990, DC emergency rooms were seeing enough PCP cases to generate formal alerts within the city's health department. The drug had maintained a continuous low-level presence in specific DC neighborhoods for 15 years, surviving the crack era by occupying market niches that crack didn't serve. Specifically, the population of users who wanted dissociation rather than stimulation, who wanted to leave their consciousness rather than accelerate it. The DC resurgence was geographically contained enough that it didn't reach national media attention with the force of the 1970s epidemic. But the medical and law enforcement professionals dealing with it recognized immediately what they were seeing. The case presentations were identical. The police response challenges were identical. A generation of emergency physicians and patrol officers who had never encountered PCP were encountering it now, without the institutional memory that their predecessors had accumulated through the brutal education of the 1970s. The training materials that the 1970s had generated, the protocols, the medical literature, the law enforcement guidelines, had not been effectively transmitted forward. Institutional memory in both medicine and law enforcement operates through active use. Knowledge that isn't regularly applied fades from operational awareness, even when it exists somewhere in filing cabinets and archived journals. The DC resurgence required a partial reinvention of knowledge that already existed, because the systems for preserving and transmitting that knowledge had allowed it to atrophy. Los Angeles experienced its own PCP resurgence in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The drug's penetration of specific communities in the San Fernando Valley and in South Los Angeles was significant enough to generate DEA field reports identifying Los Angeles as the national center of PCP production, a position the city had held in the 1970s and had apparently never fully relinquished. The underground manufacturing infrastructure that had been established in the early 1970s had never been completely dismantled. It had contracted, gone quiet, and then expanded again when market conditions were favorable. Some of the distribution networks operating in 2000 had direct organizational continuity with networks from 1975. The precursor chemical problem had never been solved. Piperidine, one of the key building blocks for PCP synthesis, remained a legal industrial chemical used in legitimate pharmaceutical and agricultural manufacturing. Attempts to restrict its sale had been partially implemented but riddled with exemptions and enforcement gaps that made the restrictions more symbolic than functional. Underground manufacturers adapted to the partial restrictions with the flexibility of any market participant responding to supply chain friction. They found alternative suppliers, developed slightly modified synthesis routes that used different precursors, and continued producing. In the Midwest, PCP resurgences appeared in specific cities during the 2000s and 2010s. Indianapolis, Cincinnati, St. Louis, typically emerging in communities with existing opioid crises, where PCP occupied a specific economic and pharmacological niche. The pattern in these resurgences was consistent: a period of low-level presence invisible to public health surveillance, a sudden cluster of extreme cases that overwhelmed unprepared emergency departments, a scramble to reinstate protocols that existed in archived literature, and a media cycle that treated the resurgence as a shocking new development rather than the predictable recurrence it was. Each resurgence carried the same footnote, unwritten but legible in the pattern. The communities absorbing the worst damage were the communities with the least political power, the fewest resources, and the most tenuous relationship with the institutions nominally responsible for their protection. The geography of PCP's harm had been consistent for 60 years. It was not accidental geography. The scientific legacy of PCP extended into territory that would have seemed fantastical to the doctors drowning in PCP cases in 1977. Ketamine, a drug synthesized as a safer alternative to PCP, also a dissociative anesthetic, also an NMDA receptor antagonist, also a drug with significant abuse potential, was approved by the FDA in 2019 as an antidepressant for treatment-resistant depression. The drug was delivered under medical supervision as a nasal spray, the synthesis pathway protected by pharmaceutical patents, the dissociative experience carefully managed in clinical settings. A cousin of the peace pill, cleaned up and repackaged, arriving in psychiatry offices to treat the very mental health conditions that PCP had spent decades creating. The pharmaceutical industry, with a straight face and apparently no awareness of the historical resonance, presented this as an innovation. The underground chemists of 2024 are not substantially different from the underground chemists of 1972. They have better information, synthesis routes available on encrypted networks rather than photocopied journal articles, and worse oversight, operating in a regulatory environment that has learned from 50 years of drug policy failure to be simultaneously more aggressive in its penalties and less effective in its outcomes. PCP still appears in DEA seizure statistics every year. It still generates emergency room admissions in cities across the country. It still requires, periodically, the reissuance of law enforcement bulletins reminding officers of the specific tactical challenges the drug presents, as though the lessons of the 1970s need to be relearned by each new generation of officers, because no one found a reliable way to teach them the first time. Victor Maddox synthesized his molecule in Detroit in 1956 with the genuine belief that he was doing something good. The scientists at Parke-Davis who tested it, who filed their patents, who approved the move toward human trials, were not villains. They were people operating within the normal optimism of post-war American science. The conviction that chemistry could solve problems, that the right molecule could improve human life, that progress was directional and reliable. That optimism was not stupid. It was the same optimism that produced antibiotics, vaccines, and surgical techniques that have saved hundreds of millions of lives. It was also the optimism that produced thalidomide, Agent Orange, and PCP. The difference between the drugs that saved lives and the drugs that devastated them was not the quality of the scientists' intentions. It was the gap between what the science could predict and what human complexity, in all its economic desperation, its social fracture, its capacity for both exploitation and self-destruction, actually produced when a new molecule entered the world. That gap has never been closed. It probably can't be. Science can characterize a molecule's behavior in controlled conditions. It cannot characterize what happens when that molecule encounters an American city in crisis, a pharmaceutical industry motivated by profit, a regulatory system compromised by politics, and a drug distribution network that can manufacture and distribute a substance faster than any government can respond. The monster in the lab coat was never just a drug. It was the collision between scientific optimism and social reality, between pharmaceutical ambition and human vulnerability, between the best intentions of people in white coats and the worst outcomes for people with nowhere else to go. It was synthesized in 1956. It was withdrawn from human medicine in 1965. It was rediscovered by the counterculture in 1967. It burned through American cities from 1973 to 1979. It receded, returned, receded again, and returned again, following the geography of American neglect with the reliability of a tide that knows exactly which shores to find. It is still out there. The molecule hasn't changed. The garage labs haven't closed. The emergency rooms haven't stopped receiving the cases. The police bulletins haven't stopped being issued. The only thing that changes is the generation encountering it for what feels, to them, like the first time. Because the history wasn't taught, the institutional memory wasn't preserved, and the conditions that made the drug attractive were never addressed with anything approaching the seriousness they deserved. That is the complete history of PCP, a drug that began as a miracle, became a catastrophe, and then became a recurring lesson that nobody seems to be able to learn more than once.